People think debts are paid with money, but that night, my father tried to pay with me. I was standing in the middle of a marble foyer that didn't belong to my life. The air too clean, too quiet, like the world had been polished for someone else. And I remember thinking this couldn't be real, because just hours earlier, I had been in our cramped apartment on the 4th floor, stepping over loose floorboards and empty bottles, trying to pretend that if I kept my head down long enough, everything would somehow fix itself. But nothing in my life had ever fixed itself. Not after my mom died. Not after my dad started drinking more than he spoke. Not after the rent notices started coming with red ink instead of polite reminders. And definitely not after the night I saw that watch on his wrist. A watch that cost more than everything we owned combined. Because my father had never owned anything expensive in his life. Not even hope. And yet there it was, gleaming under the flickering kitchen light like a warning I didn't understand yet. I asked him about it, and he just laughed. A hollow sound that didn't reach his eyes, said it was a gift, said I shouldn't worry, but I had learned a long time ago that when my father said not to worry, that's exactly when everything was about to fall apart. And it did, faster than I could prepare for, because at 11:23 p.m. someone started pounding on our door, not knocking, not waiting, just pounding like they already owned the place, like they were announcing something final. And I remember freezing in the hallway, my hand still on my backpack strap, my heart beating so loud it felt like it might answer for me. My dad went pale, actually pale, like the blood drained out of him all at once, and he whispered something I'll never forget, "Don't open it." But the door opened anyway, not because I touched it, but because the lock clicked from the outside, clean, practiced, like whoever stood on the other side had done this before, many times, and then they walked in. 3 men in suits that didn't belong in our building, the kind of suits that fit too well, moved too easily, like they were part of the men wearing them, and the first 2 barely mattered because my eyes went straight to the third, the one who stepped in last, slower than the others, like he wasn't in a hurry because the world would wait for him. Tall, composed, dark hair perfectly in place despite the rain outside, his coat untouched by the mess of our apartment. And when he looked at me, everything inside me went still, not because he was loud or threatening, but because he wasn't, because he didn't need to be. His presence filled the room in a way I couldn't explain, like gravity had shifted and we were all orbiting him whether we wanted to or not. "Marcus Carter," he said, his voice calm, measured, the kind of voice that didn't repeat itself, and my father tried to stand straighter, tried to look like he still had some control over his life. But it was already gone. I could see it in the way his hands shook, in the way he avoided eye contact. "I was going to call you," my dad said, and even I knew that was a lie. The man tilted his head, slightly, almost amused, like he'd heard every excuse before and none of them mattered. "You owe me $2 million, he said, just like that, like he was stating the weather, and the number hit me so hard I almost laughed because it didn't make sense. We could barely afford groceries some weeks. How could there be a number like that attached to us? I looked at my dad, waiting for him to deny it, to say it was a mistake, but he didn't. He just stared at the floor like if he didn't look at the truth, it might disappear. And that's when I realized something worse than the debt itself. He had known this was coming, and he hadn't told me. "I can fix it," my dad said quickly, too quickly. "Just give me time." And the man, Adrian, I would learn later, finally looked away from me and at him, but only for a second, because then his eyes came back to me, sharp, assessing, like he was recalculating something, and I felt it. That shift, that moment where I stopped being invisible in my own life and became something else entirely, something measurable, something that could be used. "Time is expensive," he said quietly, and the room seemed to shrink around us, my chest tightening with something I didn't want to name. I stepped forward without thinking. "I can work," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "I can help pay it back. We'll figure something out." Because that's what you do when everything is falling apart. You offer yourself to the problem like it might accept you as a solution. And for a second, just a second, he didn't say anything. He just watched me. And I swear I could hear my own heartbeat echoing in the silence. Then he exhaled softly, like he had made a decision long before I spoke. "You misunderstand," he said, and there was something in his tone that made my stomach drop. Something final, something that didn't leave room for negotiation. He took one step closer, not enough to threaten, just enough to change the distance between us, and suddenly I was aware of everything. The way the air felt heavier, the way my hands curled slightly at my sides, the way my father whispered my name like he already knew what was about to happen. "I don't need money," Adrian continued, his gaze never leaving mine. "I need certainty." And then, without raising his voice, without any dramatic pause, he said the words that split my life into before and after. "I'll take her instead." And the silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of everything I didn't understand yet. My father's quiet collapse, the men behind him shifting slightly like this was routine, like people were traded this way every day, and me, standing there, realizing that in a single sentence, I had gone from being someone's daughter to being someone else's solution, and I didn't know what terrified me more, the fact that he chose me, or the part of me that felt like I had just been seen for the first time. I did not cry when he said it. I did not scream either. I just stood there, because sometimes the worst moments in your life arrive so quietly your body does not know how to react. My father made a sound behind me, something broken and small, like a man realizing he had already lost everything. "Isabella, do not," he started, but his voice collapsed before the sentence could finish. Adrian did not even look at him again. That was the part that stayed with me the most. My father had spent years being the center of my world, and in 1 second he became irrelevant, replaced by a decision that had already been made. I felt something shift inside my chest, not fear, not yet something colder, something sharper. I shook my head slowly. "No," I said. The word came out steadier than I expected. "I am not something you can take." The corner of his mouth lifted just slightly, not a smile, not kindness, just recognition, like I had said something interesting. "You already have been taken," he replied softly. "You just did not know it." Yet the room felt smaller, every inch of air heavier. I took a step back, my shoulder brushing against the wall behind me, as if the apartment itself was trying to push me forward instead of letting me escape. "I am not part of his debt," I said louder this time, forcing my voice not to shake. "Whatever he owes you, that is between you and him." Adrian's eyes held mine, unblinking, calm, unmovable. "Everything has a connection," he said, "and your father already made that connection for me." I looked at my dad, then really looked at him, and saw it, the guilt, the silence, the truth he had been hiding. And in that moment, I understood something I could not undo. He had not just lost money, he had used me to try and fix it. "You told them about me," I whispered, my throat tightening around the words. He did not answer, and that silence was louder than anything he could have said. I felt the ground disappear under me. Not physically, but something deeper, something that made the world tilt just enough to feel wrong. I turned back to Adrian, anger finally cutting through the shock. "I am not going anywhere with you," I said. "If you think you can just walk in here and decide that you are wrong." For the first time, something in his expression changed, not anger, not frustration, something closer to interest, like I had just stepped into a role he had expected, but still wanted to see unfold. He took another step forward, not fast, not threatening, just inevitable, like time moving. "Whether you want it to or not, Isabella Carter," he said. My full name in his voice sounded different, heavier, more real. "How do you know that?" I asked. The question came out sharper than I intended. "I know everything that matters," he replied simply. "And right now you matter." I should have been terrified, maybe I was, but it was buried under something else, something louder, a refusal to disappear into whatever world he came from. I grabbed my jacket from the chair beside me, my hands moving before my mind could catch up. "I am leaving," I said, more to myself than to him. "I will call the police. I will report this. I will do anything except go with you." The men behind him shifted just slightly, not blocking me, not touching me, just existing in a way that made the exit feel further away than it was. Adrian did not move to stop me. He just watched as I reached for the door handle, my fingers trembling despite everything. I forced them. Still, I turned the knob, pulled the door open, and stepped into the hallway, cold air hitting my face like a reminder that the world still existed outside that apartment. For 1 second, I thought that was it, that I could just walk away, that whatever this was would stay behind me. Then his voice came from behind me, quiet, but clear enough to follow me out. "You can leave," he said. I stopped, not because he told me to, but because of how he said it. Not a threat, not a command, just a statement. I turned slowly, my hand still on the doorframe. "What does that mean?" I asked. "It means you are free to walk out that door," he replied, "but the people your father owes will not see it that way." Confusion flickered through me. "What people?" Adrian's gaze did not waver, the kind who do not negotiate, the kind who will not ask questions when they come looking for what they were promised. A chill ran through me, sharper than anything before, because suddenly this was not just about him. It was bigger, messier, more dangerous in ways I could not see. "You are lying," I said, but the words did not sound convincing even to me. He tilted his head slightly. If I wanted to force you, I would not be standing here explaining your options. That was the first time he said something that felt honest, and I hated that part of me. Recognized that my grip on the door loosened just enough for doubt to slip. In what options? I asked quietly. You come with me, he said, and your father's debt becomes my problem, not yours. I will make sure no one else comes knocking on that door again. I glanced back at my dad, still standing in the same spot, still silent, still not looking at me, and something inside me hardened, because this was the truth. No one was coming to save me, not him, not anyone else. I looked back at Adrian, and for the first time I saw something I had not noticed before. Not just power, not just control, but certainty. He knew exactly what would happen next with or without me, and that terrified me more than anything else, because it meant I was not choosing between good and bad. I was choosing between different kinds of consequences, and neither one felt like freedom. My voice dropped to a whisper. If I go with you, what happens to me? Adrian did not answer immediately. He studied me like he was deciding how much truth I could handle. Then he said something that stayed with me long after that night. You stop being a question and become an answer. I did not fully understand what that meant, but I felt it settle into my chest like something inevitable. The hallway light flickered above me, the sound faint, but sharp enough to mark the moment. I stepped back inside and closed the door behind me, not because I trusted him, not because I wanted to, but because for the first time in my life, I realized walking away would not save me. And as I turned to face him again, I saw it in his eyes, that quiet, unshakable certainty, like he had known all along exactly what I would choose. The moment I closed that door, I felt it, something invisible locking into place, like I had just stepped into a life that would not let me walk back out. Adrian did not move right away. He just watched me, as if he had been waiting for that exact sound, the click of the door sealing my decision. You made the practical choice, he said quietly, and I hated how calm he sounded. Like this was not the moment everything changed for me, but just another step in a plan he had already finished in his head. I crossed my arms, trying to hold on to something solid inside myself. This is not a choice, I said. This is me having no other options. A faint shift in his expression, not disagreement, not sympathy, just acknowledgement. Most choices are like that, he replied. Then he turned slightly, gesturing toward the door behind him. We should go now, before your situation becomes more complicated than it already is. I glanced at my father one last time. He still had not moved, still had not met my eyes, and for a second I waited. I do not know what I expected, an apology, maybe a reason, something that would make this make sense, but nothing came, just silence, heavy and final, and that silence followed me as I stepped past Adrian and into the hallway. The men behind him moved with us, not surrounding, not touching, just there like shadows that did not belong to any light. The stairwell smelled like old paint and something damp, familiar and ordinary, and I realized with a strange clarity that I was memorizing it, every detail, every sound, the echo of my steps, the flicker of the light above us, because some part of me knew I would not see this place again, at least not as the same person. The night air hit me harder this time, colder, sharper, like it was trying to wake me up from something that was already real. A black car waited at the curb, engine running, headlights cutting through the quiet street like a line I could not cross back over. I stopped a few feet away from it, my feet refusing to move any further. For just a second, I said, my voice quieter than I wanted, what happens now? Adrian stepped beside me, not too close, not too far, close enough that I could feel his presence without him needing to touch me. Now, he said, you come with me, and everything that was coming for you stops following you. I looked at the car, then back at him, and something inside me pushed back. One last time you talk like this is protection, I said, but it feels like I am being taken. He studied me for a moment, then shook his head slightly. Not taken, he said, chosen. The word hit differently than I expected, not softer, not kinder, just more complicated. I do not know why that matters, I said. It matters because I am not forcing you into the car, he replied. You are walking into it. The distinction felt small, but it settled somewhere deeper than logic. I hated that I understood it. I reached for the door handle, my hand hesitating, just inches away from it, because once I touched it, once I opened that door, there would be no pretending this was temporary, no pretending I could go back to the life I understood, even if it was broken. I opened the door and slid into the back seat. The interior smelled faintly of leather and something clean, expensive, controlled. Adrian followed a second later, taking the seat across from me, not beside me, the distance deliberate, like he was giving me space, or maybe reminding me that he did not need to be close to have control. The door closed with a quiet final sound, and the car began to move before I even had time to settle my thoughts. The City outside blurred past familiar streets, turning into something distant, almost unreal. I watched it through the tinted glass, my reflection faint against the passing lights. You are very quiet, he said after a moment. I turned my gaze toward him. I am trying to understand what just happened, I said honestly. He leaned back slightly, his posture relaxed in a way that felt intentional, like he was choosing not to dominate the space, even though he could. What part is unclear? He asked. All of it, I said. A small breath, leaving me faster than I expected. 1 minute, I am in my apartment. The next, I am in a car with a man who says I belong to him. I never said you belong to me, he corrected calmly. I frowned. You said you would take me instead of the debt. Yes, he said. That is not the same thing. It felt like the same thing, I said quietly. He tilted his head slightly, watching me with that same focused attention. Then let me be clear, he said. You are not an object, Isabella. You are not a payment. You are leverage. The word landed heavy, but not in the way I expected, not dehumanizing, not dismissive, just precise. I do not know if that makes it better, I admitted. It makes it honest, he replied, and for some reason that honesty unsettled me more than anything else, because it meant I could not simplify him into something easy to hate. The car turned onto a wider road, the buildings growing taller, the lights brighter, the world shifting from the one I knew into something sharper, more controlled. Where are we going? I asked. My home, he said simply. I let out a quiet breath, almost a laugh that did not feel like one. Of course we are, I muttered. He watched me again, that same unreadable expression crossing his face. You think this is about ownership, he said after a moment. But it is not. Then what is it about? I asked. He held my gaze steady, his voice lowering just enough to make the words feel heavier. It is about making sure no one else gets to decide what happens to you. The statement hung between us, not comforting, not threatening, just there. And for the first time since I stepped into that car, I did not feel like I was being dragged somewhere. I felt like I was being redirected, and I did not know if that was better or worse. I looked back out the window, the city stretching farther away behind us, and realized something that made my chest tighten. I was not just leaving a place, I was leaving a version of myself that did not know how complicated the world could be. And as the car disappeared into the night, I understood one thing with absolute clarity. Whatever waited for me ahead was not going to let me remain the same. The car slowed before I realized we had left the city behind. The noise faded first, then the lights, until everything outside the window became darker, quieter, more controlled, like the world itself had stepped back to make space for whatever came next. I leaned slightly forward, trying to see past the tinted glass, and then I saw it, iron gates tall enough to make the car feel small, stretching across a stone wall that seemed to go on forever. They opened before we even stopped, not with sound, not with hesitation, just smooth, silent movement, like they had been waiting for us the entire time. I did not ask how they knew we were coming. I already understood the answer. The car moved forward and the gates closed behind us with a finality I felt in my chest more than I heard. The driveway curved through perfectly trimmed trees, each one placed exactly where it was meant to be, not wild, not accidental. Everything here was intentional. I realized that immediately. This was not just a house. It was control built into architecture, into space, into silence. I sat back slowly, my fingers resting against my knees as I tried to keep my breathing steady. You live here? I asked, my voice quieter than I expected. Adrian did not look away from me when he answered. I built this here. The difference mattered. I could feel it in the way he said it. Not inherited, not given, created, shaped like everything else around him. The car came to a stop in front of a structure that did not look real, not in the way normal homes did. It was too precise, two clean lines of glass and stone rising into the night, like something designed to impress. Without asking for approval, the driver stepped out first, opening the door for me. And for a second, I did not move, my body still caught somewhere between leaving and arriving. Adrian stepped out on his side, then paused, watching me, not impatient, not forcing, just waiting. Again, that choice. I stepped out. The air felt different here, cooler, quieter, untouched by the city I had just left behind. I looked up, taking in the scale of everything. The entrance alone could have held our entire apartment without effort, and for the first time since this started, I felt something shift again, not fear, not anger, something closer to disorientation, like I had stepped into a life that did not match the one I had been living a few hours ago. This is where I am supposed to stay? I asked, still looking at the building. Adrian moved beside me, his presence steady, not overwhelming. Yes, he said simply. Until what? I asked, turning to face him fully. Until you decide what comes next, he replied. That answer did not give me comfort, but it gave me something else, clarity. He was not pretending this was temporary or permanent. He was leaving that undefined, and somehow that made it harder to fight. I nodded. once more to myself than to him, and followed him inside. The doors opened before we reached them. The interior was even more overwhelming than the outside, marble floors reflecting soft light from above, walls lined with artwork that looked like it belonged in places I had only seen in pictures. Everything silent, everything controlled. My footsteps sounded too loud against the floor, reminding me that I did not belong here, not yet, not ever. Maybe a man approached from the far side of the room, older, maybe late 50s, dressed in a suit that fit him with the same precision as everyone else here, his posture straight, his eyes sharp, but not hostile. Mr. Blackwood, he said with a slight nod. Everything is prepared. Adrian gave a small acknowledgement. This is Isabella Carter. She will be staying here for now. The man's gaze shifted to me, assessing, but not intrusive. Welcome, Miss Carter, he said, his voice calm, measured. If you need anything, you may ask me directly. My name is Victor. The first nodded, unsure what to say because nothing about this felt normal. Thank you, I managed. Adrian gestured toward the staircase. She will be in the east wing. Make sure she has everything she needs. Victor inclined his head. Of course. Adrian turned to me, then his expression unreadable, but focused. This way, he said. I followed him up the stairs, each step echoing slightly softer than before, as if the house itself absorbed sound. The further we moved into it, the hallway upstairs stretched longer than I expected. Doors, evenly spaced, each one closed, each one hiding something I did not understand. We stopped in front of one near the end. Adrian opened it without hesitation and stepped aside for me to enter. I paused for just a second, then walked in. The room was large, too large for one person, but it did not feel cold. It felt prepared, like someone had already decided I would be here before I even knew it myself. A bed positioned perfectly near the window, soft lighting, clothes laid out neatly on a chair, everything chosen, everything intentional. I turned slowly, taking it in, then looked back at him. You planned this, I said. It was not a question. He met my gaze without hesitation. I prepared for possibilities, he replied, and I was one of them. I asked. Something flickered in his eyes, not surprise, not denial, something closer to confirmation. You were always a possibility, he said quietly. The words settled heavier than I expected, because they meant this had not started tonight. Not really. Something had been moving long before I saw it. I crossed my arms again, grounding myself in the only familiar motion I had left. What exactly am I to you? I asked, this time, not defensive, not angry, just needing an answer. Adrian stepped slightly closer, not enough to invade my space, but enough that I could feel the shift in the air between us. That depends, he said, on what you choose to be. I held his gaze, refusing to look away, even though something about him made that harder than it should. Be specific, I said. His voice dropped, just slightly quieter, but clearer than anything else he had said so far. You can be someone who was taken by circumstance, or someone who understands the value of being chosen. I did not respond right away because I was still trying to understand the difference and the fact that there was one at all. I finally looked away, moving further into the room, my hand brushing lightly against the edge of the dresser, grounding myself in something physical, something real. I do not belong here, I said softly, almost to myself. Adrian's answer came without hesitation. Not yet. The two words lingered in the space between us, and for the first time since I stepped into his world, I realized something I had not allowed myself to consider before. This was not a cage, not in the way I understood cages. There were no locks, no restraints, no walls forcing me to stay, and somehow that made it more complicated, more dangerous, because it meant if I stayed it would not be because I had to, it would be because I chose to. And as I stood there in a room that already felt like it was waiting for me, I realized that might be the most difficult part of all. Silence feels different when it is not empty, but controlled. I stood in the middle of that room for what could have been seconds or minutes. I could not tell, because nothing here moved unless it was meant to. The air itself felt still, like it was waiting for me to decide something I had not even begun to understand yet. I walked slowly toward the window, my reflection faint against the glass, a version of me that did not belong in this place, not in the way everything else seemed to belong perfectly. I pressed my fingertips lightly against the cool surface, grounding myself. This is not real, I whispered under my breath. But the words did not hold any weight, because everything about this was real too. Real. The door behind me opened softly. I turned, instinctively expecting Adrian, but it was Victor instead, carrying a folded set of clothes over his arm. Miss Carter, he said politely, these were selected for you. If you require anything else, please let me know. I glanced at the clothes, then back at him. How did you know my size? I asked. The question came out sharper than I intended. Victor did not react. He simply placed the clothes on the chair near the bed. We make it our responsibility to be prepared, he replied calmly. Of course you do, I muttered under my breath. He inclined his head slightly, as if acknowledging something I had not said out loud. "Dinner will be served in 30 minutes, Mr. Blackwood. Would prefer if you joined him." I almost laughed, not because it was funny, but because it felt absurd. Dinner like this was normal, like I had just arrived here under ordinary circumstances. "I will think about it," I said. Victor gave a small nod and stepped back toward the door. "As you wish, Miss Carter," and then he was gone, the door closing with the same quiet precision everything else in this house seemed to have. I exhaled slowly, my shoulders dropping slightly. As the room settled back into silence again, I looked at the clothes on the chair, soft fabric, neutral colors, nothing loud, nothing that demanded attention, just like everything else here, controlled. I stepped closer, running my fingers over the material. It felt expensive, not in the flashy way, but in the kind of way that lasted. I hesitated for a moment, then changed out of what I had been wearing, my old clothes suddenly feeling out of place, even to me, like they belonged to someone I had already started leaving behind. When I finished, I caught my reflection again, and something about it unsettled me, not because I looked different, but because I looked like I could belong here if someone did not know better. I turned away, quickly grabbing onto that discomfort as something real, something I could still trust. One walked toward the door, paused, then opened it. The hallway was just as quiet as before, long, empty, controlled. I stepped out, my footsteps softer now, either because I had adjusted or because the house was designed that way, probably both. I followed the direction Victor had come from earlier, not sure if I was choosing to go to dinner or just moving because standing still felt worse. The staircase led me back down to the main level, where the same quiet elegance waited for me, nothing out of place, nothing unexpected except me. I moved toward the dining area, guided by soft light and the faint sound of movement. Adrian was already there, seated at the head of a long table that could have held 10 people easily, but only had 2 places set, one at the end near him and one across from him. He looked up as I entered, his gaze steady, but not surprised, like he had expected me to come, even when I had not decided that myself. "You came," he said simply. I pulled out the chair across from him and sat down. "I was curious," I replied. He nodded slightly, as if that answer made sense. Food had already been placed on the table, simple, elegant, nothing excessive. Again, everything here was intentional, controlled. "Eat," he said, not as a command, but as a suggestion. I picked up the fork slowly, my appetite uncertain, but my body reminding me that I had not eaten since earlier that day. The first bite tasted better than I expected, warm, familiar, grounding in a way that caught me off guard. "You planned this too," I said after a moment. Adrian set his glass down calmly. "I planned for many things," he replied, "including how I would react." I asked. He met my gaze directly. "I planned for resistance," he said. "I did not expect compliance." I almost smiled at that, not because it was amusing, but because it felt honest. "You seem very certain about everything," I said. He leaned back slightly, considering his response. "Certainty is not about knowing everything," he said. "It is about understanding what matters and what is not." I tilted my head slightly, studying him. "And what do I matter?" I asked. He did not hesitate. "You matter because you changed the equation." The words settled into the space between us, heavier than I expected. I looked down at my plate for a second, then back up at him. "You still have not explained what this really is," I said quietly. Adrian's expression did not change, but something in his eyes sharpened. "This is an intersection," he said. "Your life and mine were always going to cross. The only variable was how." I frowned slightly. "That does not make any sense." "It does if you know what your father was involved in," he replied. My chest tightened slightly. "What do you mean, involved?" Adrian reached for a folder beside him and placed it on the table between us, not pushing it toward me, just leaving it there, as if the choice to open it was mine. "Your father did not just borrow money," he said. "He made agreements that extended beyond him." I stared at the folder, my hand still on the table, not moving. "What kind of agreements?" My voice came out quieter than I expected. Adrian's gaze did not waver, the kind that put people at risk long before they realized it. I felt that same cold understanding return, the one that had started back in the apartment and had not left since you knew about me before tonight, I said slowly. He nodded once. "Yes," I exhaled shakily. "So this was never random?" "No," he said simply. "It was inevitable." The word echoed in my mind as I finally reached for the folder, my fingers brushing against the edge, but not opening it yet, because I already knew that whatever was inside would change everything again. And as I looked up at him one more time, I realized something that made my chest tighten even more. I was no longer just reacting to what was happening, I was stepping into it. And that might be the most dangerous part of all. I stared at the folder like it might open itself if I waited long enough, like the truth inside could somehow soften if I delayed it, but Nothing in this house softened, nothing waited for permission. I finally pulled it closer, the paper smooth under my fingers, heavier than it should have been, like it carried more than just information. I opened it slowly, expecting numbers, contracts, something I could not understand, but the first thing I saw was my name, Isabella Carter, printed clearly across the top. My breath caught, just slightly, not enough for him to notice, or maybe he noticed and chose not to react. I turned the page. Photographs, not random, not distant, but specific. Me walking out of class, me at the grocery store, me sitting on the steps outside our building. Moments I did not remember being watched, captured, and placed neatly into something that looked organized, intentional. How long? I asked, my voice quieter than before. Adrian did not answer right away. Long enough, he said finally. Long enough to understand your patterns, your routines, your choices. I flipped another page. Documents, my school records, my job schedule, things that should have been private, laid out like they belonged to someone else, not me. This is not normal, I said, my grip tightening slightly on the edge of the folder. No, he agreed calmly. It is necessary. I looked up at him, then really looked at him, searching for something, anything that would make this feel less controlled, less inevitable. You said this was about my father, I said slowly. So why am I in here? Adrian leaned forward slightly, resting his hands together on the table. Because your father stopped being the center of the problem a long time ago, he replied. You became the variable. I did not like that word, variable. It made me sound like something that could be calculated, predicted, adjusted. I am not a variable, I said firmly. His gaze held mine steady. And yet everything changed because of you. The statement sat between us, uncomfortable and impossible to ignore. I looked back down at the folder, forcing myself to keep reading, because not knowing felt worse than whatever was inside. There were notes about transactions, dates I did not recognize, names I had never heard, and then one line stood out, highlighted in a way that made it impossible to miss. Collateral, extension clause, subject, dependent. I frowned slightly, my eyes moving back over the words, as if they might rearrange themselves into something less concerning. What does this mean? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Adrian did not soften when he answered. It means your father extended his agreements beyond himself. I felt that same cold drop in my stomach, like something inside me had just been confirmed, not created, but confirmed. He used me, I said, not asking, not hoping, just stating it. Adrian did not interrupt. That is one way to interpret it, he said. I closed the folder slowly, my hands steady, even though everything inside me was not. I stared at the surface of the table for a moment, then looked back at him. Why did you not tell me this earlier? I asked. Because you would not have believed me, he replied simply, and he was right. I would have denied it, argued, found any reason to reject it, because accepting it meant accepting something about my father I had spent years trying to ignore. I leaned back slightly, the chair cool against my back. This does not explain you, I said after a moment. Adrian tilted his head slightly. Go on. You knew about me, you knew about all of this before tonight. So why now? Why take me instead of just letting whatever was coming happen? His expression did not change, but something in his eyes shifted, focus tightening slightly. Because I do not leave outcomes to chance, he said, and you represent too many unknowns. I almost laughed again, not because it was funny, but because it felt absurd. I am an unknown, you are a disruption, he corrected gently. I stared at him for a second longer, then looked away, my thoughts moving faster than I could organize them. So, what happens if I had not come with you? I asked quietly. Adrian's answer came without hesitation. Then someone else would have come for you. The simplicity of it made it worse, not dramatic, not exaggerated, just a fact. I swallowed slowly, my throat tightening around the weight of that reality. And they would not have given me a choice, I added. He held my gaze. No, they would not. Silence settled between us again, but it felt different now, not empty, not controlled, but full of something heavier, understanding, maybe, or acceptance. I did not want. I pushed the folder slightly away from me, as if putting distance between it and myself could change what it meant. So what am I now? I asked finally, not looking at him at the table, at my hands, at anything but him. Adrian's voice was steady when he answered. You are protected. The word landed, but it did not feel like relief. It felt like something else, something that came with a cost. And what does that protection require? I asked. He did not respond immediately, and that pause told me more than any answer could. This is where it changes, I said softly. He nodded slightly. Yes. I let out a slow breath, then looked up at him, again meeting his eyes directly. I am not going to pretend this is something it is not, I said. I am not grateful, I am not comfortable, and I am definitely not yours. A flicker of something crossed his expression, not irritation, not anger, something closer to approval. I would not expect you to be, he said. Then what do you expect? I asked. His answer came quiet but clear. I expect you to understand that staying here Gives you time to decide who you are in this situation. I frowned slightly. What does that even mean? He leaned forward just enough to close the distance between us without touching me. It means you can remain someone reacting to what was done to you, or you can become someone who decides what happens next. The words settled deeper than I expected, because they were not controlling, they were not demanding, they were offering something I had not considered before: agency in a situation that had taken everything else from me. I looked down at my hands again, then back at him, and for the first time since this started, I did not feel like I was being cornered. I felt like I was standing at the edge of something I did not understand yet, and that scared me more than anything else, because it meant whatever happened next might not just be about him, it might be about me too. And as I sat there in a house that felt like it had been waiting for me long before I arrived, I realized one thing with unsettling clarity: I was no longer just part of someone else's decision, I was becoming part of my own. The most dangerous moment is not when you lose control. It is when you realize you never had it. I did not say that out loud, but the thought stayed with me as I sat across from Adrian with the folder still resting between us like something unfinished. I pushed my chair back slightly, the sound soft, but enough to break the stillness. I need air, I said, not asking, not waiting for permission. He nodded once, as if he had already expected that reaction. There is a terrace through the hall to your right, he said, his voice calm. As always, I stood up without another word, leaving the folder where it was, because I was not ready to carry that with me. Yet the hallway felt longer this time, quieter, like the house was watching me differently. Now that I knew more, I followed the direction he had given me until I found the glass doors leading outside. When I stepped through them, the night air wrapped around me, cooler than before, sharper in a way that made everything feel more real. The city lights were far in the distance, barely visible from here, just a faint glow reminding me that my old life still existed. Somewhere beyond this place I walked toward the edge of the terrace, my hands resting lightly against the stone railing, the surface smooth, cold, steady. Everything I was not my reflection appeared faintly in the glass behind me again, but I did not turn to look at it this time. I did not need to. I already knew what I would see: someone caught between two versions of herself, neither one fully real. Yet I closed my eyes for a moment, letting the quiet settle around me, trying to piece together everything that had happened in just a few hours. My father, the debt, the folder, Adrian, the way he spoke, the way he looked at me, like I was not just part of the situation, but something central to it. I opened my eyes again, staring out into the darkness. I should hate him, I whispered, the words barely audible, even to myself. But the problem was I did not nod in the way I expected. I was angry, yes, confused, absolutely. But hate required something simpler, something clearer, and nothing about him was simple. I heard the door behind me open softly, but I did not turn. I already knew it was him. I did not look at you like that, I said before he could speak, my voice steady despite everything, like what he asked, his tone neutral, like he was genuinely asking, not challenging, like I was something he had already decided on. I said. I finally turned to face him, leaning back slightly against the railing. Adrian stood a few feet away, not too close, not too far, that same careful distance he always kept. You were, he said calmly, just not in the way you think. I frowned slightly. Then explain it. He stepped closer, not enough to close the space completely, but enough that his presence felt more immediate. You think I chose you because you were available, he said, but that is not how I make decisions. Then how do you make them? I asked. He held my gaze steady. I choose what holds value long term. The words settled differently than I expected, not dismissive, not transactional, just precise, like everything else about him. I am not an investment, I said quietly. Something shifted in his expression, then not quite a smile, not quite anything I can define. Yet here you are, he replied. The statement lingered between us, not as an argument, but as a fact. I exhaled slowly, looking away for a moment, then back at him. You keep talking like I have control in this, I said, but I am here because I did not have a choice. Adrian's voice softened just slightly, not weaker, just less sharp. You are here because you made the only choice available to you, he said. That is still a choice. I shook my head. That does not feel the same. He tilted his head slightly, studying me. Maybe not, he said, but it matters more than you think. I fell silent again, the wind brushing lightly against my skin, carrying the faint scent of something unfamiliar, something clean, distant. I wrapped my arms around myself, not because I was cold, but because I needed something to hold on to, something real. What happens if I leave tomorrow? I asked suddenly. Adrian did not hesitate. Then you leave, he said simply. I blinked, slightly caught off guard. That is it? I asked. You just let me walk away? He nodded. Yes. The answer felt too easy to Simple. I searched his face for something that would explain it, something that would make sense of it. Why, I asked. Because forcing you would remove the only thing that makes this work, he said quietly. And what is that? I asked. His gaze did not waver. Your willingness to stay. The words hit harder than anything else he had said, not because they were threatening, but because they were not. I looked away again, my thoughts shifting faster than I could keep up. You are saying this is about me choosing this, I said slowly. He gave a small nod. Yes. I let out a quiet breath, then laughed once under my breath, not out of humor, but disbelief. You brought me here because my father put me in danger. You knew I could not walk away, and now you are telling me this is about my choice. His expression did not change, but his voice dropped, just slightly more grounded than before. I am telling you that what happens next depends on what you decide to do with the situation you are already in. I stared at him for a long moment, the weight of his words settling into something deeper than argument, deeper than resistance, into something that felt uncomfortably like truth. I looked back out at the distant lights again, then down at my hands resting against the railing. They were not shaking anymore. I noticed that detail before anything else. The fear that had been there earlier had shifted into something steadier, something more controlled. I do not know what I am supposed to be here, I said finally. Adrian's answer came, without hesitation. Then do not be anything. Yet the simplicity of it caught me off guard. Just observe, understand, learn, he continued. There is no requirement for you to become anything until you decide what matters to you. I turned back to him slowly, and for the first time I did not feel like I was being positioned or analyzed. I felt like I was being given space, not freedom, not yet, but space. And that was something I had not expected. I nodded once more to myself, then to him. Then I will stay for now, I said, the words quiet but firm. Adrian did not react immediately. He just watched me like he was confirming something internally. Then he gave a single nod. That is enough, he said, and for some reason those 3 words felt heavier than anything else, because they were not about control or possession. They were about something else, something I was only just beginning to understand. And as I stood there on that terrace with the night stretching endlessly in front of me, I realized something that shifted everything again. I was not just surviving this situation anymore. I was starting to step into it. Staying is easy the first night. It is the morning after that makes it real. I did not realize I had fallen asleep until I woke up in a bed that did not belong to my life. The ceiling above me smooth, unfamiliar, the lights softer than anything in our apartment ever allowed. For a second, I stayed still and not moving, not thinking, just listening. The silence here was different, not empty, not lonely, just quiet, like the world had decided not to interrupt me. I turned my head slowly, taking in the room again, the same one from last night, but it felt different now, less like something temporary and more like something waiting. I sat up slowly, the sheets still warm around me, grounding me in the fact that I had actually stayed, that this was not something I could wake up from. I swung my legs over the side of the bed, my feet touching the floor, cool and solid, and for a moment, I just sat there, my hands resting in my lap. What now? I whispered to no one, because that was the question that mattered, not what happened, not why, but what came next. I stood and walked toward the window, pulling the curtain back slightly. The view stretched out further than I expected, trees lining the property, perfectly arranged. Beyond them, the faint outline of the city in the distance, still there, but no longer within reach. I pressed my palm lightly against the glass. This is real, I said quietly, not as a question, but as acceptance. A soft knock broke the silence behind me. I turned instinctively, my body reacting before my thoughts did come in. I said. The door opened just enough for Victor to step inside, his presence as composed as always. Good morning, Miss Carter, he said, his voice calm, measured, like nothing here ever rushed. Breakfast will be ready shortly. Mr. Blackwood has already started his day. I nodded slowly. Of course, he is, I muttered under my breath. Victor did not react. If you would like, I can show you around the property after breakfast, he offered. I hesitated for a second, then nodded yes, I think I need that. He inclined his head slightly. I will meet you downstairs in 10 minutes. The door closed behind him with that same quiet precision, and I exhaled slowly, my shoulders dropping just a little. As I turned back to the room, I moved through it more naturally this time, not because I belonged here, but because I was starting to understand how to exist in it. I got dressed in the clothes that had been left for me again, simple, controlled, nothing that drew attention. When I looked at myself in the mirror this time, I did not look away immediately. I studied my reflection longer, taking in the details, the way I stood, the way my expression had changed. There was something steadier there, something less reactive, and that unsettled me more than anything else, because it meant this place was already affecting me. I turned away before I could think about it too much and headed Downstairs, the dining area was the same as last night, but Adrian was not there this time, only the table set neatly, breakfast already prepared. I paused at the entrance for a moment, scanning the space, as if expecting him to appear out of nowhere. He did not. Victor stood nearby, waiting, without pressure, without expectation. I moved toward the table and sat down, the chair sliding back quietly beneath me. "You are adjusting quickly," he said as I reached for the glass of water. I looked up at him slightly. "I do not know if that is a good thing," I replied. He gave a small, thoughtful nod. "Adaptation is not weakness, Miss Carter, it is awareness." I considered that for a moment before taking a sip of water, the coolness grounding me further. I ate slowly, not because I was hungry, but because the routine of it felt normal in a way everything else did not. When I finished, Victor gestured toward the hallway. "If you are ready, we can begin." I stood, wiping my hands lightly on the napkin, and followed him outside. The morning air felt different from the night, clearer, brighter, but still controlled, like even the daylight had rules here. We walked along a path that curved through the property, everything maintained perfectly, the grass trimmed, the trees aligned, nothing out of place. "How big is this place?" I asked after a moment. "Approximately 20 acres, Victor replied calmly. I stopped for a second, looking around. 20 acres, that was more space than I had ever imagined belonging to one person, and yet here it felt normal, expected. We continued walking, and I noticed something else, cameras positioned subtly, not obvious, but present. "Security," I said, more as a statement than a question. Victor nodded. "Of course, this environment requires it." I glanced at him. "Requires it, or you choose it?" I asked. He met my gaze briefly. "Both," he replied. The honesty surprised me more than anything else. We walked in silence for a few minutes longer, until we reached a section of the property that overlooked a lower level of land. The view stretched out, open and unobstructed. For the first time since I arrived, I felt something close to freedom, not complete, not real, but a glimpse of it. "If I wanted to leave," I said slowly, "could I?" Victor did not answer immediately. He seemed to consider the question carefully before responding. "You could attempt to leave," he said finally. I frowned slightly. "That is not the same thing as leaving." He gave a small nod. "No, it is not." I looked back out at the distance, the open space that still somehow felt contained, and understood something new. This place did not hold me physically. It held me in a different way, through information, through awareness, through control that did not need walls to exist. I turned back toward the house, my eyes scanning it with a different perspective now, not just as something impressive, but as something intentional, something built not just to protect, but to define the boundaries of everything inside it. We walked back in silence, and as we approached the entrance, I saw him, Adrian, standing near the doorway, speaking quietly with someone I did not recognize. He looked up the moment we got closer, his attention shifting to me instantly, not intense, not overwhelming, just present. "You are exploring," he said as I stopped a few feet away. "Yes," I replied. "I needed to see where I am." His gaze held mine for a second, longer than necessary. Then he nodded. "Good." I studied him in return. Something about him felt different in the daylight, clearer, sharper, less like a shadow, and more like something solid, something real. And for the first time, I did not feel like I was reacting to him. I felt like I was observing him. And as that realization settled into place, I understood something that changed everything again. I was no longer just inside his world. I was starting to understand it. Understanding something does not make it less dangerous. It just makes you harder to fool. I stood there a few feet away from Adrian, with the morning light cutting across the entrance behind him, and for the first time, I did not feel smaller in his presence. I felt aware of it, like I could see the space he occupied instead of being pulled into it. "You said I should understand this place," I said slowly. "So tell me, what exactly am I supposed to see?" Adrian dismissed the man beside him with a slight nod, his attention returning fully to me. "You are already seeing it," he replied. I shook my head slightly. "That is not an answer." He stepped closer, not invading my space, just narrowing the distance enough to make the conversation feel intentional, then asked the right question. I held his gaze steady. "What is this really?" I asked. "Not the house, not the land, all of it." His expression did not shift, but his voice lowered just slightly. "It is structure." He said, "Everything here exists for a reason. Nothing is random. Nothing is left to chance." I glanced around briefly, the clean lines, the controlled movement, the quiet precision. I noticed it. I said, "It is all planned." He gave a small nod. "Yes." I looked back at him. "And where do I fit into that plan?" I asked. His answer came without hesitation. "You do not yet." The simplicity of it caught me off guard. "You brought me here," I said, "but I am not part of it." "Not yet." He repeated that phrase again, like it meant something more than I understood. I frowned slightly. "Then explain it." Adrian studied me for a moment, longer than necessary, like he was deciding how much to say. You are here because of a situation, he said, but what you become here that is not decided yet. I crossed my arms, instinctively grounding myself. That sounds like a test. He tilted his head slightly. If it were a test, there would be an expected outcome. He said, this is not. That then what is it? I pressed his gaze, held mine steady. A transition. The words settled in a way that made everything feel slightly off balance. I exhaled slowly, looking away for a moment, then back at him. You keep talking like I have control over this, I said. But every step I have taken so far has been because of something outside of me. Adrian did not argue. That is true, he said, but what happens next is not. I went quiet again. That pattern was becoming familiar. Every time I thought I understood the situation, he shifted it just enough to make me question everything again. What happens next? I repeated. He gestured lightly toward the grounds behind me. You continue to observe, he said. You learn how this world works, and then you decide if you want to be part of it. I let out a quiet breath. That sounds like a choice. He nodded it. As I almost laughed again, not because it was funny, but because it felt impossible. You said, if I leave, there are people who will come looking for me. I said, that does not feel like a real choice. Adrian's expression remained calm. It is not a safe choice, he corrected, but it is still a choice. I studied him carefully. Something about the way he spoke, the way he did not try to convince me or pressure me, it made everything more complicated, not less. Why are you doing this? I asked. Finally, his answer came quieter than before. Because you were already involved. The simplicity of it made me pause. That is it, I asked. That is enough, he said. I turned away from him, slightly looking out across the property again. But this time I was not just seeing the space, I was thinking about the systems behind it, the decisions, the structure, the control that made everything function. This is not just about you, I said slowly. It is bigger than that. Adrian did not deny it. No, it is not. I looked back at him then, and for the first time I felt like I was seeing something closer to the truth. You are not just protecting me, I said. You are managing something. He gave a small nod. That is part of it. I took a step closer, now closing some of the distance between us without realizing it. What part of it am I asked. His eyes held mine steady. The part that has not been defined yet. Again, that phrase, not yet. It lingered like something unfinished, something waiting. I exhaled slowly, then nodded once more to myself. Okay, I said quietly. I will learn. His expression shifted slightly, not surprise, not approval, just acknowledgement. That is the first step, he said. I glanced past him toward the house, then back at him. What do I need to know first? I asked. Adrian considered the question briefly before answering. Understand that everything here has a purpose, he said, including you. I frowned slightly. I am not sure I like that. He gave a faint, almost imperceptible shift of expression. You are not supposed to like it, he said. You are supposed to understand it. I let that settle for a moment, then nodded again, more firmly this time. Then show me, I said. The words came out stronger than I expected, more certain than I felt. But they were real. Adrian studied me for a second longer, then turned slightly, motioning for me to follow. There are things you need to see, he said. I hesitated for just a fraction of a second, then stepped forward, moving with him, not because I was being led, but because I had decided to walk. And as we entered the house again, I realized something that changed everything once more. I was no longer just trying to survive this situation. I was starting to engage with it. And that shift felt more powerful than anything else that had happened so far, because it meant whatever came next would not just be done to me, it would involve me. Power is not what you see, it is what you start to understand. I followed Adrian through the hallway, this time not as someone being led, but as someone paying attention. Every detail felt sharper, now the placement of doors, the quiet movement of people, the way nothing interrupted him. As he walked, it was not fear. I realized it was structure. People knew where they stood in relation to him, and they did not step outside of it. We turned down a corridor I had not seen before, the lighting slightly dimmer, the air cooler. What is this part of the house? I asked. Adrian did not slow down. This is where decisions are made, he replied. The words landed heavier than I expected. We stopped in front of a set of double doors. He opened them without hesitation and stepped aside for me to enter. I paused for a fraction of a second, then walked in. The room was different from everything else I had seen, less decorative, more functional. A long table, screens along one wall, files arranged with precision. People stood near the far end of the room, speaking quietly. But the moment Adrian entered the room, shifted, not dramatically, not obviously, but enough that I felt it. Conversation stopped, not out of fear, but acknowledgement, presence. I stepped further inside, my eyes moving across the space, taking everything in. This is your operation, I said quietly. Adrian walked past me toward the center of the room. It is part of it, he replied. One of the men approached him, handing over a tablet. Adrian glanced at it briefly, then returned it without a word. The man nodded, and stepped back, no hesitation, no question. I watched the exchange closely. He does not need to explain himself. I thought the system already understands him. Adrian turned slightly toward me. This is where information is processed. He said everything that matters passes through here. I folded my arms lightly, trying to keep my thoughts steady. Everything meaning what? He looked at me directly. People, movements, agreements, outcomes. I let that settle in my mind. This was not just a house, not just wealth. It was coordination on a level I had never seen before, and I was standing inside it, observing it, not as an outsider anymore, but not fully inside either. Where do I fit into this? I asked again, not out of confusion, but because I needed to understand the structure. Adrian did not answer immediately. Instead, he gestured toward the screens. Come here. I hesitated for a second, then walked closer. One of the screens displayed a map, not just streets, but layers, information moving across it, patterns I did not fully understand, but could feel the logic behind routes, timings, coordination. What am I looking at? I asked. Your city, he said simply. I frowned slightly. It does not look like my city. It is not the version you were shown, he replied. I stared at the screen longer, then looked back at him. You see everything, I said, not as admiration, but realization. He held my gaze enough to make decisions. He corrected. I turned back to the screen, my reflection faint against the movement of data. Then I saw something that made me pause. A small section highlighted, a familiar street, my street. I stepped closer instinctively, my eyes narrowing. That is where I lived, I said. Adrian did not react. I know. A cold realization settled in my chest. You were watching it, not just me, everything around me. He nodded once. Yes. I turned toward him fully, now my voice sharper. Why me out of all of this? Why focus on me? Adrian's expression remained steady. Because you were connected to a point of instability, he said, and I do not ignore instability. I took a step back, processing that word, instability. You are talking about my life like it is a problem to solve, I said quietly. His answer came without hesitation. It was a problem to solve. I went silent again, not because I agreed, but because I understood the logic behind it. Even if I did not like it, I looked around the room again. The people, the screens, the quiet efficiency, everything here existed to prevent uncertainty, to manage outcomes, and I was brought into it, not randomly, not emotionally, but intentionally. You said I could choose what I become here, I said slowly. So what happens if I choose to understand this? He studied me for a moment longer than before, then answered, then you stop being a variable and become part of the system. The words felt heavy, not restrictive, not freeing, just real. I looked back at the screen again, the map, the movement, the structure, and for the first time, I did not feel overwhelmed by it. I felt something else, curiosity. I turned to him again, my voice steady. Show me how it works. Adrian's gaze held mine a fraction longer, then he gave a small nod. As you wish, he said. One of the men nearby stepped forward, immediately adjusting the display, explaining quietly how the system tracked movement, how decisions were made based on patterns. I listened carefully, not interrupting, not reacting, just absorbing the information piece by piece. It was not chaos. It was not random. It was calculated, layered, built over time. I could see it now, the logic, the reason behind everything I had thought was just power for the sake of power. After a few minutes, I spoke again, softer than before, but more certain than I had been since I arrived. This is not about control, I said. Adrian looked at me. Then what is it about? I met his gaze directly. It is about preventing loss. He did not respond immediately, and that silence told me I was closer to the truth than before. I looked back at the screen, then at the room around me, and realized something that shifted everything once again. I was no longer just observing his world. I was starting to understand why it existed. And that made it harder to walk away, because understanding changes everything. It removes the illusion that things are simple. It forces you to see the reasons behind choices. And as I stood there in a room that processed the kind of information I had never even imagined, I realized something that settled deep in my chest. I was not just stepping into his world anymore. I was beginning to see it the way he did. The moment you understand the system, you realize you were never outside of it. I stayed in that room longer than I expected, not because I had to, but because leaving felt like walking away from something unfinished. The screen in front of me still alive, with movement patterns, shifting lines, connecting data points that I was only beginning to recognize as more than just information. I leaned slightly closer, my eyes tracking a route as it updated in real time, and without thinking I spoke. If this changes here, then that route becomes exposed, I said quietly. One of the men beside me paused, glancing at Adrian before responding. Yes, that is correct. His tone careful, not questioning, not dismissing, just acknowledging. Adrian did not say anything at first, but I felt his attention shift toward me, not heavy, not overwhelming, just present. I straightened slightly, realizing what I had just done. I should not understand this, I said, more to myself than to anyone else. Understanding is not restricted, he replied calmly. I turned toward him, a slight frown forming. Then why does it feel like I am crossing into something I should not know? Because you are, he said simply. The honesty of it did not scare me the way it should have. Instead, it settled into something else, something steadier. I looked back at the screen again, my thoughts moving faster than before. If everything here is about preventing loss, then why not remove the variables entirely? I asked. Adrian stepped closer, this time not to close the distance, but to align with my perspective. You cannot remove all variables, he said. You can only manage them. I nodded, slowly processing that. Then you prioritize which ones matter, I added. His gaze held mine for a second, longer than usual. Exactly. A quiet realization settled over me, not sudden, not dramatic, just clear. This was not about power in the way I had always imagined it. It was about control, through understanding, through preparation, through structure. I stepped back from the screen, my arms crossing loosely as I turned fully toward him. You said I could decide what I become here, I said slowly. So what happens if I decide I do not want to be managed? His expression did not shift. Then you define your own position, he replied. I narrowed my eyes slightly. That sounds like a challenge. He tilted his head slightly. It is an opportunity. One, let out a quiet breath, something inside me tightening, then settling again. I do not belong in this, I said. He did not argue. That is not for me to decide, he said. I held his gaze longer, this time not looking away, not retreating. Then who decides? I asked. His answer came quieter than before. You do. The words landed differently, now not like an abstract idea, but something real, something that required action. I glanced around the room again. The people, the systems, the quiet precision, everything here had a place, a function, a reason, except me, not yet. And for the first time, I did not feel like that was a weakness. I felt like it was space to choose, to define something instead of being defined by it. I looked back at him. Then what if I choose something you do not expect? I asked. A faint shift crossed his expression, not concern, not resistance, something closer to interest. Than I will adapt, he said. The certainty in his voice was not arrogance, it was confidence, built from something deeper, something that had been tested over time. I nodded, slowly absorbing that response. Then I turned back toward the screen again, this time not as someone trying to understand, but as someone considering how it worked, how it could be approached differently. I pointed toward a section of the display. This area, I said, the data here is delayed by a few seconds. The man beside me glanced at it, then back at Adrian before answering. Yes, there is a slight delay. I tilted my head slightly. Then that creates a gap, small, but enough to matter, I said. Adrian stepped closer, his gaze shifting to the screen, then back to me. What would you do about it? He asked. I paused for a moment, thinking through the logic, then answered. I would not close the gap immediately. I would observe how it behaves first, see if it reveals a pattern before correcting it. Silence followed. Not uncomfortable, not tense, just present. I looked back at him, expecting dismissal or correction, but instead he nodded once. That is a valid approach, he said. The acknowledgement surprised me more than anything else, not because I needed it, but because it meant something I had not expected. I was not just being observed anymore, I was being considered. I stepped back again, my thoughts settling into something clearer, something more structured. I do not know what I am becoming here, I said quietly. Adrian's voice came steady. Then do not define it. Yet I nodded, slightly understanding that now, not just hearing it. I glanced around the room one more time, then back at him. But I am not the same as when I arrived, I added. He did not deny it. No, you are not. I exhaled slowly, the weight of that realization settling into something real, something undeniable. I was changing, not in a way that erased who I was, but in a way that expanded. It forced me to see things I had never considered, to think in ways I had never needed to before, and that was not something I could ignore anymore. I looked at him one last time before turning slightly toward the door. Then show me more, I said, the words coming out steady, without hesitation. This time Adrian watched me for a moment longer, then gave a small nod. As you wish, he replied. And as I walked beside him out of that room, I realized something that shifted everything again. I was no longer just understanding his world, I was starting to think inside it. And that might be the point where everything truly changes, the moment you start thinking like them. You stop knowing where you end, and the system begins. I walked beside Adrian through another corridor, this one quieter, more isolated, the kind of space that felt intentionally removed from everything else. The walls here were darker, the lighting softer, not dim, but controlled, like it was designed to focus, not distract. Where are we going? I asked, my voice steady, but lower than before, not out of fear, But awareness this felt different, more private, more deliberate. Adrian did not slow down. A place where decisions are tested before they become real, he replied. The words settled deeper than I expected. We stopped in front of a single door, no guards, no screens, just a smooth surface that gave nothing away. He opened it and stepped aside. I hesitated for only a second before walking in. The room was smaller than the others I had seen, but it felt heavier, not physically, but in purpose. A table in the center, two chairs facing each other, nothing else, no decoration, no distraction, just space. I turned slowly, taking it in. What is this? I asked. Adrian entered behind me, closing the door with a quiet final sound. This is where you learn to decide, he said. I frowned slightly. I already make decisions every day, I said. He shook his head slightly. Not like this. I crossed my arms, instinctively grounding myself again. Then explain it. He moved toward the table, sitting down without hesitation, as if the space belonged to him completely. Sit, he said, not as a command, but as a direction. I stepped forward slowly and took the seat across from him. The chair felt solid, unmoving, like everything else here. Good, he said. Now we remove everything else. I tilted my head slightly. What do you mean? No noise, no pressure, no external influence, he replied. Just the decision and the reason behind it. I studied him carefully. You brought me here to teach me how to think. He did not deny it. No, I leaned back slightly, my eyes narrowing. Then give me something to decide. Adrian reached into his jacket and placed a single sheet of paper on the table between us, not pushing it forward, just placing it there. Like everything else here, it was my choice to engage. I picked it up, slowly scanning the contents. It described a situation, not personal, not emotional, just structured. A location, a timeline, a variable introduced at a specific point, disrupting an otherwise stable pattern. I read it twice, then looked up at him. This is hypothetical, I said. It is simplified, he corrected. I frowned slightly, considering that. Then what is the decision? He leaned forward, just slightly enough to bring focus back to the center of the table. Do you intervene immediately, or do you wait? I looked back down at the page, my mind already moving through the information. If I intervene immediately, I said slowly, I stop the disruption before it spreads, but I also reveal the point of control. I paused, then continued. If I wait, I risk escalation, but I gain more information about the pattern. Adrian did not interrupt, did not guide, just watched. I tapped the paper lightly with my finger, thinking through the variables. Then I wait, I said finally. His gaze sharpened slightly. Explain. I met his eyes directly. Because immediate action solves the problem, but does not teach me anything. Waiting allows me to understand the source of the disruption, which prevents it from happening again. Silence followed. Not empty, not tense, just present. Adrian leaned back slightly, studying me longer than before, and he gave a single nod. Acceptable. The word felt simple, but it carried weight. I set the paper down slowly. That was not random, I said. He shook his head. No. I let out a quiet breath. Of course it was not. I looked around the room again, then back at him. You are not just showing me how things work, I said. You are seeing how I think. He did not deny it. Correct. I leaned back in my chair, my arms crossing loosely. Again, and what happens if I think differently than you expect? He tilted his head slightly. Then I learned from it. The answer caught me off guard. Not defensive, not controlling, just honest. I studied him more carefully, now trying to understand something that had been shifting since I arrived. You do not need me to think like you, I said slowly. He met my gaze steadily. No, I need you to think clearly. I looked down at the paper again, then back up at him. And what happens when I do? His voice lowered just slightly. Then you become someone who is not easily controlled. The words settled into me deeper than anything else he had said, not because they were powerful, but because they were true. I sat there for a moment longer, letting that sink in. Then I nodded once more to myself. I understand, I said quietly. Adrian's expression did not change, but something in his eyes shifted. Acknowledgement, maybe, or confirmation. Good, he said simply. I stood up slowly, the chair moving back with a soft sound that seemed louder in the quiet room than it should have been. I looked at the table, the paper, the space where the decision had just been made, then back at him. This is not about your world, I said. It is about how I exist in it. He did not correct me. No, it is not. I exhaled slowly, feeling something settle inside me, something that had been unstable before becoming clearer, more defined. Then, I am not just learning your system, I added. I am learning myself. Adrian stood, as well as presence, steady, as always. Exactly, he said. And as we walked toward the door together, I realized something that changed everything again. I was no longer trying to figure out where I fit into his world. I was starting to decide what my place in it would be, and that decision felt more powerful than anything else that had happened so far. Because for the first time since this began, I was not reacting, I was choosing. The hardest truth is not that your life changed, it is that you chose to let it. I stepped out of that room beside Adrian, and the door closed behind us with the same quiet certainty as everything else in this place, but this time it felt different, not like something ending, but like something beginning. I did not stop walking right away. I moved down the hallway, slowly, my mind still turning over everything that had just happened, the paper, the decision. The way I had answered without hesitation, and more importantly the fact that I had not questioned myself after that. I paused halfway down the corridor, my hand brushing lightly against the wall, grounding myself in something physical, something real. You are quiet, Adrian said from behind me, his voice steady. As always, I turned slightly to face him. I am thinking, I replied. He studied me for a moment, then gave a small nod. Good. I looked at him fully. Now not with confusion, not with resistance, but with something clearer, something more intentional. You said this is about choosing who I become, I said slowly. He did not interrupt. So, I am going to choose. His gaze sharpened, just slightly, not surprised, not concerned, just focused on what I would say next. I took a breath, steady, controlled, then continued. I am not going to be someone who gets pulled through this. I am not going to be managed or positioned or reacted to. I am going to understand it and then decide where I stand. Adrian held my gaze without breaking it. And for the first time, there was no need to prove anything, no need to challenge or resist. The space between us felt balanced, not equal, not the same, but aligned in a way it had not been before. Then choose, he said quietly. I nodded once and turned away from him, continuing down the hall, but this time my steps felt different, not hesitant, not reactive, but deliberate. I knew where I was going, not because I had been told, but because I had decided. I moved through the house with a different awareness, now noticing things I had missed before, the way people moved with purpose, the way information flowed quietly through the space, the way everything connected without needing to be explained. I reached the main room again, the screen still active, the same system still running, but it did not feel overwhelming anymore. It felt structured, something I could navigate. I stepped forward. One of the men glanced at me briefly, then back to his work. No hesitation, no confusion, just acknowledgement. I moved closer to one of the displays, my eyes scanning the data, the patterns, the movement. I understood more now, not everything, but enough to see the logic behind it. I reached out, adjusting a small parameter, not changing anything significant, just observing how the system responded, and it did instantly, recalibrating, shifting, slightly adapting. I felt it, then not power, not control, but clarity. I stepped back slightly, watching the adjustment settle, then I spoke. Without turning, if everything here is about preventing loss, then there is something missing. Adrian's voice came from behind me. What is missing? I turned to face him fully. Perspective, I said. You are watching everything from above, from a structured point of view, but you are not accounting for how people behave when they are not predictable. His expression remained steady. Explain. I crossed my arms lightly, thinking through it, then continued. Patterns are only reliable until someone decides not to follow them. And when that happens, the system reacts. Instead of anticipating, Adrian stepped closer, his attention focused entirely on me. So what would you change? I met his gaze directly. I would introduce controlled unpredictability, I said. Small variables that test the system continuously so it does not rely on static patterns, but learns to adapt in real time. Silence followed. But it was not empty. It was full of evaluation, not just from him, but from the space itself. I could feel it, the shift, the way the idea settled into something real. Adrian studied me longer than before, then gave a slight nod. That would increase complexity. He said it would increase resilience. I corrected quietly. Another pause, then he nodded again, once more, this time more decisively. Implement a limited version, he said to the man nearest the screen. The man responded immediately, adjusting the system based on what I had said. No hesitation, no question, just execution. I watched the changes unfold on the display, the patterns shifting slightly, the system recalibrating, and for the first time, I was not just observing it, I was influencing it. I exhaled slowly, something settling deep in my chest, something that felt like ownership, not over the system, not over the space, but over my place in it. I turned back to Adrian and held his gaze steady. I am not here because of my father anymore, I said quietly. I am here because I chose to stay. He did not argue that. No, he said simply. I nodded once, then I will define what that means, I added. His voice remained calm, but there was something different in it now, something that had not been there before. Acknowledgement, then define it, he said. I looked around the room one last time, the system, the structure, the world I had stepped into, and realized something that felt both heavy and clear. I had crossed a line, not one that trapped me, but one that changed me. I was no longer just someone caught in someone else's decisions. I was someone making my own, and as I turned back toward the screen stepping forward, without hesitation, I understood the truth that would follow me long after this moment. I was not taken, I was not placed, I was not owned, I chose this, and that choice meant everything.